The iron door of Veldrath prison had never once in its 40 years of standing been opened from the inside by anything other than a key. Until the night Borgakh Thunderroar decided she was done waiting for someone to come save her. She had been in cell 7 for 11 days. 11 days of water that smelled like rust and bread that crumbled to gray dust, and the particular kind of silence that only exists when a place has held too many people for too long, and their suffering has soaked into the stones. She was 24 years old, broad-shouldered, and built the way mountains are built, not with elegance but with permanence. Her skin was the deep, earthy green of river moss in summer, and her tusks, though modest by the standards of the Highland clans, curved upward with quiet authority. Her black hair was braided back in the practical way of a woman who had not been raised to make herself decorative, and her eyes were the color of amber caught in firelight, warm and dangerous at once. She had been arrested for striking a merchant in the Veldrath market square. The merchant had put his hands on a girl, a human girl, no older than 12, who had been trying to sell river clams from a basket near his stall. Borgakh had seen it, and she had acted, and she did not regret it for a single heartbeat of those 11 days. What she regretted was that the magistrate had listened to the merchant, a man with coin and connections and the right color of skin, and not to her or to the girl, and so here she was, rotting. On the 11th night she sat with her back against the cold stone wall and looked at the cell door and made her decision the way she made all her decisions, without a great deal of ceremony. She stood. She crossed to the door. She pressed both her large, calloused palms flat against its rusted surface and felt the age in the metal, the way the hinges had been poorly maintained, the way the frame had shifted over years of settling stone. She was not merely strong in the way people meant when they said an orc woman was strong, as though it were a threat or a curiosity. She was strong in the way of someone who had spent her whole life being told she would need to work twice as hard to earn half as much, and who had obeyed that instruction without complaint. She pushed, not with fury, with purpose. The hinge nearest the floor tore free of the stone frame with a sound like a ship's timber splitting. The upper hinge held a moment longer, groaning and twisting, and then the whole door came inward with a crash that shook dust from the ceiling and rattled the chain on the lantern at the corridor's end. Borgakh stood in the gap where the door had been, breathing steadily, her hands dark with rust and old iron. And Amos Ramsey, who had been the night guard of cell block 7 for going on 3 years, who had been sitting on his wooden stool at the corridor's end, with a book of maps open across his knees, because there was never anything to do on night watch, looked up at the sound of that crash and saw her standing there in the dark with the ruined door at her feet. He was 26 years old, lean and long-limbed in the way of men who had grown up doing physical work without ever quite putting on the weight that work promised, with brown hair that never quite laid flat and a jaw that was perhaps a little too square to be called handsome but was honest, which was better. He wore the plain gray uniform of a Veldrath prison guard, a wool coat, heavy boots, a ring of keys at his hip that clearly had not been necessary tonight. His book of maps slid off his knees and landed on the stone floor with a soft smack. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the door on the floor behind her. He looked at her hands. Then Amos Ramsey, who was not a bold man in the romantic sense but was a precise one, said the only thing that was true. "You came back," he said, and that was the sentence that changed everything, because it was not what anyone else would have said. Anyone else would have shouted. Anyone else would have reached for their baton or their whistle or run for the warden's office. But Amos Ramsey said, "You came back," as though he had been expecting her, as though she were someone he had been waiting for. Borgakh stood very still. "What did you say?" He closed his mouth, then opened it again. He had the look of a man who had just said something slightly beyond what he intended. "You were in here 7 years ago," he said carefully. "You were 17. They brought you in for fighting in the Thornwell Road 3 men who had roughed up an elder on his way through town. You spent 1 night and then someone paid your fine and you were gone." He paused. "You had the same braid, She stared at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everyone." He said it without pride, just as a statement of fact. "I have a good memory." She looked at the door again. Then she looked back at him, and for the first time in 11 days she felt something that was not quite suspicion. "Are you going to sound the alarm?" He reached up very slowly and unhooked the whistle that hung at his collar. He set it on the floor beside his book of maps. Then he looked at her steadily. "I read the merchant's complaint and I read your account," he said. "The girl confirmed what you did and why. The magistrate didn't call her as a witness." He stood, unfolding from the stool with the slow deliberateness of someone who did not want to make any sudden movements. "I think you should go," he said. "I think you should go right now, before anyone comes to check on the sound." Borgakh did not move immediately. She was reading his face the way she had learned to read all human faces, searching for the angle, for the thing he wanted from her, for the shape of the trap. She found none. "You will lose your position," she said. "Possibly." He bent and picked up his book of maps and closed it. "But I'll know I did the right thing, and I can live on that better than I can live on the other." She crossed the corridor in 4 long strides and was past him before he could draw another breath, heading for the outer door that she already knew led to the service yard, and the broken section of the perimeter wall that the maintenance crew had been meaning to fix for 2 months. She stopped at the corridor's turning and looked back. "What is your name?" she asked. "Amos Ramsey," he said. "What's yours?" "Borgakh." And then, because she had been raised to give her full name to someone who had just given her something of value, she added, "Borgakh Thunderroar." "I know," he said. "I told you I remember everyone." She left. And he stood alone in the corridor with the ruined door at his feet and the lantern swinging gently overhead and his book of maps in his hands. And he thought that he was probably going to be in a great deal of trouble come morning, and that it had been entirely worth it. He was dismissed from his position 8 days later. The warden was not unkind about it. He had been a good guard, reliable, quiet, never a problem, but the outer door had been confirmed as unlocked from the inside, and that pointed to negligence at minimum. Amos accepted the dismissal without argument, packed his small room at the back of the prison block into a canvas bag, and walked out of Veldrath on a gray morning in early autumn with 32 copper marks, a change of clothes, his book of maps, and no particular plan. He was not a man given to self-pity. He had been raised on his father's small sheep farm 2 days east of Veldrath, had taken the guard position at 19 because the farm had been sold to pay a debt after his father died, and had spent the years since in the gray corridor of cell block 7, doing what he could within a system that did not always allow for much. He was not bitter about the work. He was not bitter about being dismissed. He was, if he was honest with himself, more alive in that single moment of watching Borgakh Thunderroar step through the gap where the door had been than he had felt in 3 years of night watches. He did not know what to do with that information. He walked east, the direction he knew best, and he thought about it. 3 weeks later, on a drizzling afternoon, he was sitting at the counter of a waystation inn on the Thornwell Road, 2 days from Veldrath, working through a bowl of vegetable broth and trying to decide whether to keep going east or turn north toward the mining settlements where he had heard there was work, when the door of the inn opened and Borgakh Thunderroar came in out of the rain. She was wearing a traveling cloak that was too short for her by a full handspan, which told him it had been borrowed or traded for and not bought. She had a pack that was clearly heavy and a look on her face that was the look of a person who has been walking in the rain for long enough that they have moved beyond discomfort into a kind of aggressive indifference to all weather. Her eyes swept the room in the quick, habitual scan of someone accustomed to rooms that might not welcome her. She saw him at the counter. She stopped. He looked up from his broth. For a moment neither of them said anything. "You," she said. "Me," he agreed. She crossed to the counter and sat on the stool beside him, setting her pack on the floor with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their back. The innkeeper, a stout woman in her 50s named Dora Pelk, who had been wiping the counter, looked between them and said nothing, which was the mark of a good innkeeper. You were dismissed, Borgakh said. I was, because of me. Because I made a decision, not the same thing. He gestured at the broth. Can I get you a bowl? It's better than it looks. She looked at the broth. She looked at him. Then she said, yes, and he signaled to Dora and another bowl appeared. They ate in silence for a while, which was a more comfortable silence than it should have been between two strangers, and then Borgakh said, Where are you going? North, maybe. There's mining work, or east. I grew up east. The east road has been closed near Turns Crossing, she said. Rockslide 3 weeks ago. No passage until spring at the earliest. You came from the east. I went east after I left. I have kin near Hollowbrook. She paused. They asked me not to stay. The town council had been making things difficult for the Orc settlement, and my presence, a fugitive, would have made it worse for them. He heard the flatness in her voice when she said it, the precise tone of someone who is stating a fact they have had a long time to make peace with. He did not offer sympathy, because he could tell she was not looking for it. He offered instead something practical. The north road through Sable Ford is open, he said. I checked the way station board this morning, and they're hiring teamsters and general hands at the lumber camps in the Greywood. The Greywood camp has historically been, he paused, choosing the word carefully, mixed. Orcs and humans both have worked there. She turned her head and looked at him very directly, the way a cat looks at something it has decided to evaluate. You are trying to help me, she said. I'm providing information, he said carefully. What you do with it is your own business. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. You are like this, she observed. You say the smaller true thing instead of the larger comfortable thing. I've been told it's a failing, he said. It is not a failing, she said. They sat with that for a moment. Then Borgakh said, I am going north as well. There is a clan encampment near the Greywood that takes in travelers during the cold months. If the lumber camp is hiring, she stopped, seemed to assess something interior. We could share the road. It is safer for two than one. That is a practical fact. It is, he agreed. You are not afraid of me, she said. It came out not as a statement but as something between an accusation and a question, as though she were still trying to understand what to do with this information. Should I be? She considered. Most people are. I watched you tear a cell door off its hinges with your bare hands, he said, and then stand there in the corridor and ask if I was going to sound the alarm, like a person who had the option to simply walk over me and chose not to. I don't think afraid is the right word for how I think about you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, What is the right word? He thought about it seriously, the way he did most things. Impressed, he said, and curious. And she looked at him for another long moment. And then she did actually smile, briefly and with some reluctance. And the smile transformed her face the way morning light transforms a stone wall. It was still the same structure, but suddenly there was warmth in it that had not been visible before. They left the way station the next morning while the mist was still thick on the road. The north road to Sable Ford was 4 days on foot, 2 of them through thick second-hand forest where the road narrowed to a track, and the trees closed over it like cathedral vaulting. They walked at a pace that suited Borgakh's longer stride, which meant Amos occasionally had to stretch his legs somewhat, and they talked, not constantly, but in the way of people who are discovering that silence together is not uncomfortable, and who therefore appreciate the speech when it comes. He learned that she had grown up in a clan camp in the hill country north of Hollowbrook, the second youngest of 6 children, and that her mother was the clan's head healer and her father the lead hunter, which meant she had been raised with a foot in both worlds, the world of careful knowledge and the world of physical capability, and that she had been sent south to Veldrath at 17 to trade on behalf of the clan, which was when she had been arrested the first time for the Thornwell Road incident. Who paid the fine? He asked. An elder of my clan, she said. A woman named Grath. She was traveling south herself and happened to be in Veldrath that day. She heard about my situation and came to the magistrate's office and put down coin and spoke for me. Borgakh was quiet for a moment. She told me I was right to defend the elder on the road, But she also told me that being right without power is a dangerous position, and that I should learn when to use my hands and when to use my words. Sounds like wise counsel. She was wise. She died 4 years ago. A pause. She would have had strong opinions about the merchant in the market square. Such as, she would have said that I was right to intervene, and she would have said that I should have been faster about it so there were no witnesses. She glanced at him sideways. She had a practical view of justice. He laughed, and it surprised him, a real laugh, sudden and warm. And she looked at him when he laughed with the look of someone who had not expected that sound and was unexpectedly glad of it. He told her about his own history more slowly, more sparingly, the way he did everything. That he had grown up on the sheep farm east of Veldrath, that his father had been a careful man, and a kind one who had nonetheless borrowed against the farm during a hard year, and then had the bad timing to die before he could repay it. That Amos had been 19 and had tried to work the debt down and had not quite managed it, and that the prison guard position had been offered through a man who had known his father and thought it was decent work for a young man who needed steady employment. Was it decent work? She asked. He thought about it. Some of it, he said. The nights I could read or study maps and no one needed me, those were decent enough. The nights someone in the cells was in a bad way, and there was nothing I could do because the rules were what they were, those were harder. You cared about the prisoners. I cared about people, he said, slightly uncomfortable with the directness of it, which I suppose made me not ideally suited to being a guard. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. On the second night they made camp in a clearing off the road, splitting the work without discussion, him gathering wood and building the fire, her setting up the small canvas shelter from the pack she carried with a systematic efficiency that suggested she had done it many hundreds of times. They ate from their separate stores, but she had cured meat and dried herbs and he had hard cheese and dried apple, and by some unspoken negotiation these things ended up shared between them, and the meal that resulted was better than either would have had alone. After they ate, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, she said without preamble, "Tell me about the maps." He looked up. "What? You were reading a book of maps the night I left. When it fell off your knees," she gestured at his pack. "You still have it. I have seen you look at it twice on the road today." He pulled it out. It was a battered thing, the spine repaired twice with leather cord, the pages worn at the edges from handling. He opened it and showed her not the standard survey maps of the main roads, but the ones he had been filling in himself, in the margins and on the blank pages at the back, for 3 years. The secondary roads, the seasonal tracks, the way station locations, the places where the water was clean and where it wasn't, the settlements that were welcoming to travelers of various kinds and the ones that weren't. She studied the pages by firelight for a long time, her large finger tracing routes, her brow furrowed. "This one," she said, pointing to a notation in his cramped handwriting near the northern edge of his coverage. "What does this mark mean?" He leaned in to see. "That's a ford that's crossable in late summer and early autumn, but not in spring or after heavy rains. It's not on the official maps." "I know that ford," she said. "I have crossed it. You are correct about the timing." She looked at him. "How did you know?" "A drover told me about it 2 years ago. He came through on the north road with a herd and mentioned it. I wrote it down." She was quiet, studying the map. Then she said, "You should continue doing this. These maps, they are more useful than the official ones. The official ones are made by people who travel with escorts and stay at inns. These are made by someone who actually looks at the world." He felt the warmth of that in a place that had been cold for a while. "I don't know what use they'd be," he said. "I'm not a cartographer." "You are," she said simply. "You just have not been paid for it yet." He put the book away, and they were quiet for a while with the fire between them, and the forest made its nighttime sounds all around, the owls and the small rustlings and the wind in the high branches, and Amos Ramsey sat across from Borgakh Thunderroar and felt, for the first time since the morning he had walked out of Veldrath with his canvas bag, that he was not quite so uncertain about everything. They reached Sable Ford on the 4th afternoon. It was a small market town, larger than a way station village but not as grand as Veldrath, built along both sides of a river crossing where the stone bridge had been replaced twice, and the third version was already showing its age. There was a market square, a public house, a temple, several rows of merchant buildings, and an orc encampment of perhaps 40 souls on the north bank of the river, visible from the bridge, a collection of solid timber and canvas structures that had the look of something that had been temporary for so long it had become permanent. Borgakh's posture changed when they crossed the bridge. Amos noticed it, not a tension exactly, but a readiness, the adjustment of someone entering a space where they knew the rules might change on them without warning. He did not comment on it. Instead he said, "There's an inn on the south side, the Sable Heart, that has a reputation for being reasonable." The way station board had a notice from them. "You are suggesting we stay there before going to the lumber camp," she said. "I am suggesting it. The camp is another half-day's walk north, and it's getting dark." She nodded once, and they went to the Sable Heart. The innkeeper was a young man named Peter Voss who looked at them both with the frank assessment of a businessman determining potential trouble, and then, apparently finding none, showed them the available rooms without incident. They took 2 rooms, which were small and clean and cost a modest amount, and agreed to meet downstairs for the evening meal. At the table in the public room, they encountered what Amos had known was likely to happen eventually, a knot of men at the bar who had been drinking since mid-afternoon and who found the sight of an orc woman sitting at table with a human man worth commenting upon. The comments were not quiet. Borgakh heard them. Her amber eyes moved in their direction and then away, with the particular studied blankness of a person who has decided not to engage. Her jaw was set. Amos heard them too. He sat for a moment, and then he did something that he would later not be able to fully explain. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was resting flat on the surface, and he said quietly and directly to her, "Ignore it. They're drunk and they're small, and neither of those things is your problem." She looked down at his hand on hers. He became aware suddenly of the size differential. Her hand was significantly larger than his, her fingers long and strong, and his hand covered only part of it. He did not remove it. "They will not leave it alone," she said, equally quiet. "I know," he said. "Give me a moment." He stood and crossed to the bar and said something to Peter Voss in a voice too low to carry, and Peter Voss nodded and then spoke to the men, and within 15 minutes they had paid their tab and left, with a great deal of muttering. Amos returned to the table. "What did you say?" she asked. "I told him they were disturbing the peace of his establishment and asked him to handle it," Amos said. "He's a businessman. He doesn't want trouble any more than we do." She looked at him with an expression that had something complicated in it. "You did not fight them," she said. "You did not threaten them." "No," he said. "Fighting them would have given them the excuse they were looking for, and threatening them would have been stupid since there were 6 of them. The point was to make them irrelevant, not to make ourselves feel better. Most men who have traveled with me choose the second option." "I'm not most men," he said, and then caught himself and added, "or I hope I'm not." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said in a different tone, quieter, with something more exposed in it, "Thank you, Amos." It was the first time she had used his name, and the way she said it, with that slight lower resonance that the Orc dialect gave to vowels, was something he was going to remember for a very long time. They found work at the Greywood lumber camp within 2 days of arriving north of Sable Ford. The camp manager was a barrel-chested man of mixed heritage named Corvin Tusk, whose father had been Orc and whose mother had been human, and who had spent his entire life refusing to be defined by either side's expectations of him. He hired Borgakh as a feller. She was, he said without a trace of condescension, better suited to that work by physical capability than most of his crew, and he hired Amos as his camp recorder, which meant keeping track of the lumber inventory, the payroll, the equipment lists, and the supply orders. When Amos showed him the map book, Corvin Tusk leaned over it for a long time and then said he would also pay Amos additionally to update the camp's route maps for the timber haul roads. "It seems," Borgakh said that evening, standing outside the log bunkhouse she had been assigned while he told her the terms of his employment, "that someone was right about the maps." "Someone may have been," he acknowledged. She had the smile again, brief, reluctant, and warming. He was finding that he looked forward to it with an intensity that was probably unwise, given that they had known each other for less than 2 weeks, and she was, he reminded himself, a woman who had broken a cell door off its hinges with her bare hands, which was either a tremendous warning or an extraordinary recommendation, and he was not entirely sure which. The Greywood camp settled into its rhythms with them in it. Autumn deepened around them, the trees going gold and copper, and a deep red that made the whole forest look like it was slowly catching fire. The work was hard and regular, and had the quality that Amos had always found most settling about physical labor. It was honest, and when it was done, it was visibly done. He kept his records and updated his maps, and in the evening sat at the common table in the camp's main hall and read, or spoke with the other workers, or watched the fire. Borgakh worked with the felling crew, swinging the great two-handed axes that the lighter men used in pairs, and was treated after the first week with the straightforward respect of people who judge by capability and competence. She was quiet at the common table in the evenings, not unfriendly but contained, the way a person is contained when they have learned that offering too much is sometimes dangerous. But she sat near Amos, not quite beside him, with the comfortable proximity of someone who has decided that one person in the room is safe and is staying within that gravitational field without making a declaration of it. He noticed. He did not mention it. He filed it in the same interior ledger where he had filed the first time she smiled, and the sound of his name in her mouth, and the warmth of her hand under his in the public room at the Sable Heart. One evening in late autumn, nearly 6 weeks into their time at the camp, there was a storm, a proper one, the kind that comes off the northern ranges and brings 3 inches of rain in a single night, with lightning and the crack of trees in the forest and the smell of cold iron in the air. The camp hall filled with everyone not on essential duty, crowded and warm, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a second jug of the rough apple spirit the camp cook made in a still behind the cookhouse. Borgakh was sitting at the far end of the common table, turned slightly away from the noise and the crowd, which was her typical arrangement in loud social situations, and Amos brought 2 mugs of something warm from the cook stove and sat beside her, actually beside her, not across, and close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She looked at the mugs. "What is this?" "Heated cider with some spices. The cook calls it winter comfort. It's better than the spirit." She took the mug and wrapped both hands around it, which was a gesture he had come to recognize as her version of physical settling, the way some people hug themselves. She sipped it. She made a small sound of appreciation that she seemed not to have intended to make. "You always notice what people need," she said, "before they know they need it." "Observant," he said, "occupational hazard from the night watch." "No," she said, "it is not the night watch, it is you." She paused, looking at the fire. "You see people, not what they are, not what they look like or what they come from. You see what they need and you move toward it." She turned her head and looked at him directly. "I have not met many people like that." He looked back at her. The firelight made her eyes the deepest possible amber, and the warmth of the room and the cider had put color in her cheeks beneath the green, and she was very close, and he was suddenly and acutely aware of all of this. "You see people too," he said. "You just show it differently. You act instead of speaking. You broke a cell door to protect yourself, but the reason you were in that cell was because you acted to protect a child you didn't know." She was quiet for a long time. The fiddle player started something slow and low-noted. "I am afraid," she said finally, very quietly, "of what I am starting to feel." He did not look away. "So am I," he said. "That makes 2 of us." "It is complicated," she said. "You are human, I am orc. The world does not. I know what the world does," he said. I also know what I know, which is that I have been happier in the 6 weeks I have known you than I was in 3 years before that, and I don't think that's nothing, whatever the world thinks of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Amos," just his name again in that way. "Borgakh," he said in the same tone because she deserved that. And then very slowly she leaned the side of her head against his shoulder. It was a small gesture, almost tentative, enormous in what it said. He sat very still, afraid that any movement might make her reconsider, and after a moment he felt himself settle into her warmth and let his shoulder bear her weight and thought that this was, in some strange and uncomplicated way, exactly where he was supposed to be. The storm raged outside. The fire burned steady inside. The fiddle played on. Winter at the Greywood was a long thing, deep and white and sometimes brutally cold, but the camp was well provisioned and well built, and there was enough work through the quieter months in maintenance and planning that everyone had purpose. Borgakh and Amos had, by some combination of gradual navigation and mutual unspoken agreement, arrived at something that was not courtship in any formal sense that either of their traditions would have recognized, but was nonetheless unmistakably and tenderly that. They spent their evenings together as a matter of course. They really talked, the kind of talking that required the trust built of months of reliable companionship. He told her about the dreams he had kept quiet most of his life, the idea of a small holding somewhere with good land and water access, where he could raise a few animals and keep his maps and not spend his days waiting for someone else to give him permission to exist within his own life. She told him about the healer's training she had received from her mother and never finished, about the knowledge of plants and remedies that she carried, but had never had the sustained, settled time to practice. He asked her questions about that knowledge with a genuine interest that made her talk for an hour straight without stopping, which she then mildly embarrassed herself about, and he told her that he would happily have listened for 2 hours. She said to him, one evening in January when the snow was so deep the camp's outer gate was sealed, and they were all inside by necessity, "My people have a concept called a life bonding. It is not the same as a human marriage, although it is sometimes translated that way. It means the choice to make someone your primary person, to face the world with them as your witness and your anchor. It is taken seriously. It is not done lightly." He looked at her carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" She met his eyes. "Because I am telling you what I think about when I look at you," she said, "and because I think you should know so that you can decide if it frightens you." "It doesn't frighten me," he said steadily. "Amos." She set down the carved wooden cup she had been turning in her hands. "I am not a simple person to love. I am aware of what the world will say. I am aware of the difficulties. My own people will have opinions." "Your people will have opinions. There is no part of this that is uncomplicated." "No," he agreed, "but I don't think anything worth having is uncomplicated." He paused. "I grew up thinking that if I was quiet enough and careful enough and worked hard enough, things would be simple. They weren't. They aren't. I lost the farm anyway. I got dismissed anyway. Careful doesn't protect you from the world. It just means you face the mess without having tried the thing you actually wanted." He looked at her steadily. "You are the thing I actually want, Borgakh, and I am not interested in being careful about it." She was very still for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on the side of his face, gently, which was perhaps the gentlest thing those hands had ever done, and she said, "Then we will be complicated together." He turned his face slightly into her palm and said, "Yes, that's exactly what I want." He kissed her for the first time that evening, in the corner of the common hall with the snow pressing against the shuttered windows and the fire burning low. It was a careful kiss, at first, the kind of kiss that asks a question and waits for the answer. The answer she gave was to curve one large hand around the back of his head and kiss him back in the way of someone who has been thinking about doing exactly this for longer than they have admitted. When they separated, she looked at him with that evaluating amber gaze. "All right," she said, which was the most understated possible response to what had just happened, and which was so entirely her that he nearly laughed. "All right," he agreed, equally understated, and she did laugh, a low sound of genuine amusement, and he filed that in his interior ledger too. Spring came to the Greywood with a slow return of color and the sound of meltwater and the smell of turned earth coming up through the snow. The camp shifted back to full operations, and with spring came the question of what came next. The lumber camp was year-round work, but it was not a life. It was the kind of work that sustained you while you figured out where you were actually going. Amos had spent the winter making connections with 2 merchant houses that used his updated route maps, and had offered to pay him on a continuing basis for new survey work. Borgakh had, in the quieter winter months, resumed the healer's training that had been interrupted years before, aided by a woman at the Sable Ford Orc encampment named Hessa, who was the settlement's herbalist, and who had taken a strong interest in Borgakh's half-formed knowledge, and set about completing it. On an early May morning, sitting on the top step of the camp's supply house with the whole green world opening up around them, and the smell of pine resin warm in the air, Amos said, "I've been looking at land." Borgakh, who had been stitching the sole back onto one of her boots, looked up. "Land. In the Clearwater Valley, about a day north of Sable Ford, there is a parcel that was surveyed 3 years ago and never taken up. Good soil, river access, southern exposure on the slope where the cabin would need to go. It's in a region that the Territorial Land Grant Office is trying to open for settlement." He paused. "It's not expensive. I have enough saved from the map work, and the 2 merchant contracts would continue." She looked at him steadily. "You are talking about a holding." "I am talking about the thing we talked about in January," he said. "If you want it." "If you want to," he stopped, took a breath, tried again. "I am not talking about asking you to follow me to a piece of land. I am talking about us going to a piece of land together. You with your healer's knowledge and me with my map work, and both of us with, I don't know, a few goats probably. I've been told I'm good with goats." "You have never mentioned goats before," she said. "I had goats on the farm. I miss goats." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Hessa has been teaching me the management of a healing practice. She says that the Clearwater Valley has no established healer within 2 days' ride. She mentioned it 3 weeks ago. She did not know I might." She stopped, a pause. "She did not know we were considering the valley." "We weren't 3 weeks ago," he said. "No," she said, "but it seems the valley may have been considering us." He smiled. She looked at the boot in her hands and then looked out at the spring forest and then looked back at him. "I want it," she said. "The land, the goats, all of it." She set the boot down. "All of it," she repeated more quietly, and by all of it, they both understood she meant something larger than any list of tangibles. "Then we go," he said. They left the Greywood lumber camp on a warm morning in late May, with good references from Corvin Tusk and a detailed survey of the Hall Road network that Amos had spent all spring completing, and they walked north from Sable Ford with everything they owned between them and the full green weight of summer coming. The Clearwater Valley land was exactly as described, and better. The parcel was a gentle slope above a tributary of the Clearwater River, with a stand of old oak along the northern edge that would provide shade in summer and windbreak in winter, and a flat lower meadow where the soil was deep and dark and looked as though it had been resting under grass for a long time, waiting to be asked to do something. There was a ruined foundation. Someone had started something here years ago and not finished, and the stones of it were good granite, still solid and could be reused. They camped the first week in a canvas shelter while Amos walked the full extent of the parcel and Borgakh assessed the plant life, what grew naturally, what the soil would support, what medicinal plants she could cultivate alongside food crops. She came back on the 3rd evening with her hands full of leaves and stems, and a look of focused excitement that he had not seen on her before, a different quality from her usual contained competence. This was joy. "This slope has 4 of the 7 plants I need for a complete fever remedy," she said, sitting cross-legged by the fire and spreading out her collection. "And if I can establish the other 3 by cultivation, Hessa sent me seeds, I could have a functional healing practice running within 2 years, possibly 1. He was watching her sort the plants with that efficient, absorbed care. "You are very happy right now," he said. She looked up, seemed slightly self-conscious. Then she said, "Yes, I am," and smiled fully and without reluctance, which was a different thing than the small, reluctant smiles he had been collecting for months. This was the whole thing. He felt it reach into him like sunlight through a south window. "Good," he said, and went back to his measurements, and she went back to her plants, and the fire burned between them in the clear summer night. And this ordinary, working, comfortable, mutual thing was the foundation of everything they would build. Building the cabin was the work of their first summer. They had enough money to hire a local carpenter from the Sable Ford settlement for the main frame and the roof. A man named Joskin Breck, who arrived with 2 apprentices and a wagon of lumber, and had the good-natured professional focus of someone who builds things for a living and is not very interested in who lives in them afterward. Borgakh and Amos did the stone work themselves, relaying the old foundation and extending it, and the hauling and the chinking and the finish work. And by late August they had a solid, low, 2-roomed cabin with a good fireplace, a plank floor, and a covered porch that faced south and caught the last of the evening light. On the evening the cabin was finished, they stood on the porch together and looked out at the meadow and the river below and the far hills going purple in the dusk, and Borgakh said, "My mother needs to know." He turned his head. Is there something I should do? Something I should say or offer?" Or he was aware that he did not know Orc courtship customs beyond what she had told him, and he did not want to fail her in the thing that mattered. "I want to bring you to her," she said. "When the weather is good and the road is safe. It will be a long journey. She is still in the hill country north of Hollowbrook." She paused. "She will have opinions." "All mothers do," he said. "Orc mothers have them more forcefully," she said. But there was something soft in the way she said it, something that was also love. "I can handle forthright," he said. "I prefer it." The journey north to the Thunderroar clan camp took 8 days each way, made in early autumn when the weather was settled. They brought gifts, hard cheese from the dairy at Sable Ford. A set of good steel implements that Borgakh's father had mentioned in a letter was needed. A jar of the apple spirit from the Greywood camp that Borgakh said was considered a decent diplomatic gesture among her people. And they arrived on a gray afternoon to find the camp considerably larger than Borgakh had remembered, nearly 60 souls, with 3 new structures added in the years she had been away. Her mother, Borgakh Thunderroar, was a woman of perhaps 50, formidable in the specific way that healers who are also clan heads become formidable. She carried knowledge the way other people carry weapons, visibly and with clear intention. She looked at Amos with a long, unblinking assessment, and then said something in Orcish to Borgakh that Amos did not understand, but that Borgakh responded to with a firmness that he recognized as her serious voice. What Marga had said, Borgakh translated for him later, was, "He is small." What Borgakh had said in return was, "He has other qualities." To his face, Marga said, in accented but clear common tongue, "You are the one who let her go." "I am," he said. "You were punished for it." "I was dismissed," he said. "It was entirely fair within the rules of the position. I had left the corridor unsecured." Marga looked at him steadily. "You do not regret it?" "Not for a moment," he said. "She was imprisoned unjustly. The right thing was to let her go." Another long silence. Then Marga said, "And now you are asking to bond with my daughter." "I am asking your knowledge of her and your blessing on us," he said carefully. "She is her own person and she has made her own choice. I'm not asking your permission. I am asking he searched for the word, your recognition. That is different." Marga looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Borgakh. Then she said something in Orcish again and turned and went back into the camp's main hall, which Borgakh said was as close to a welcome as they were likely to get on the first day, and which was actually a reasonably good sign. He spent 3 days in the Thunderroar camp, and by the end of those 3 days he had sat through 2 extended meals with the whole family, helped repair the fence of the camp's small livestock pen at Borgakh's father's casual suggestion, gotten into a long and genuinely engaging conversation with Borgakh's eldest brother Drukat about winter hunting routes in the hill country that had resulted in Drukat asking to see the map book, and then borrowing it for a full afternoon, and been given. On the morning of their departure, a small carved token by Borgakh Thunderroar that Borgakh told him quietly was a clan recognition piece. Not a full acceptance, but a signal that he was acknowledged as a person of the Thunderroar's acquaintance, which was more than she gave most humans. "She likes you," Borgakh said as they walked south, the camp behind them. "She thinks I am small," he said. "She thinks you are small and also that you are probably worth keeping," Borgakh said. "For my mother this is high praise." He reached across and took her hand as they walked, which they had been doing since January, and she curled her fingers around his, her grip always careful with him, as though she was conscious of her own strength, and they walked south together in the autumn morning with the hills golden around them and a life taking shape ahead. The Clearwater holding grew with the seasons. The goats arrived in the spring of their second year, 4 of them, from a farmstead near Sable Ford, 2 females and their kids, and Borgakh looked at them with an expression that was either skepticism or incipient affection, and within a week it was definitively the latter. The medicinal garden was planted, tended, carefully expanded. Amos completed a full survey map of the Clearwater Valley region on behalf of the Territorial Land Office, and was commissioned for 2 additional surveys, which provided steady income through a period when the valley was beginning to attract new settlers. New settlers meant neighbors, and neighbors meant the question of how Borgakh and Amos were received, as a couple became a live and present thing rather than an abstract one. Some of the new valley families were entirely indifferent to the particulars of who they were to each other, focused as new settlers are on the 1,000 practical concerns of establishing themselves. Some were openly uncomfortable. One family, the Hargroves, who settled a parcel 2 miles south, made their discomfort known in the specific passive way of people who speak to one member of a couple and not the other. Borgakh handled this with a combination of patience and self-containment that Amos found both admirable and quietly heartbreaking, because he could see the cost of it in the evenings when she was more tired than the physical work alone would have made her. He wrote a letter to the valley's newly appointed land steward, a man named Davin Cole, who was responsible for registering new settlers and managing community disputes, making the case that the holding they had established had been legally registered, that Borgakh's healer's practice was providing a service to the entire valley, and that any community friction based on the nature of their household was worth the steward's attention. Davin Cole came to the holding in person, which Amos had not expected, and spent an afternoon there, and drank Borgakh's herbal tea, and looked over her healing records, and asked Amos about the survey maps, and left with a thoughtfulness in his expression that 2 weeks later manifested as an official letter to all registered holders in the Clearwater Valley, formally stating that the valley's land charter made no distinction on grounds of race or household composition in the allocation of settler rights, and that any disputes arising from such distinctions would be treated as disruptions of the peace. It did not resolve everything. It never does. But it resolved something, and the Hargroves eventually came around slowly, grudgingly, and ultimately genuinely, after Borgakh treated their youngest daughter for a serious chest illness one winter night and refused any payment beyond the firewood they could spare. On a spring evening in their 3rd year on the holding, sitting on the south porch in the last light, Borgakh said to him, "I want to do the life bonding, formally, the full ceremony." He looked up from the survey notes in his lap. "You do." "I have been thinking about it since autumn," she said. "I have spoken with my mother. She will come." A pause. "If you want it." "I want it," he said immediately. "I have wanted it since January of the first winter. I just did not want to presume." "You are never going to stop not presuming, are you?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "Probably not," he said. "I find it," she said slowly, "simultaneously endearing and occasionally maddening. That seems fair." She reached out and covered his hand with hers there on the porch arm, in the way she had of doing this casually, as though it were simply the natural arrangement of things, which by now it entirely was. "Amos," she said, "in front of my clan and whatever humans we choose to invite, I want to stand with you and say that you are my life bonded, my witness, my anchor." She paused. "Is that clear enough?" "It is the clearest thing you have ever said to me," he said. "Good," she said. "Then stop not presuming and start planning." The ceremony happened on a clear day in late summer, in the lower meadow of the holding where the grass was thick and the river could be heard. Borgakh Thunderroar came with Borgakh's father and 2 of her brothers and their families, 16 people in total from the clan, making the journey south with a good grace that told Amos that Borgakh's standing with her family had shifted in the 3 years since he had walked into Marga's assessment and survived it. From the human side of things, there was Davin Cole and his wife, and Joskin Breck the carpenter and his partner, and Hessa from the Sable Ford encampment who had taught Borgakh her healer's practice, and who cried openly throughout the ceremony, and was entirely unapologetic about it, and Corvin Tusk from the Greywood camp, who had made the long trip south, and arrived looking as though traveling was not his preferred activity, but he had done it anyway because it mattered. The ceremony was a blend of Orcish and human tradition, which they had worked out together over the preceding months, partly through Borgakh's knowledge of clan practice, and partly through a series of respectful letters to a human temple elder in Sable Ford who had been unexpectedly enthusiastic and helpful. The Orcish elements involved the exchange of carved tokens representing their respective clans and the speaking of intention before witnesses, which Borgakh did in both Orcish and the common tongue, so that everyone present could hear. The human element was the ring, a plain iron band, which Amos had made himself at the Sable Ford Forge over 2 evenings, not because it was elaborate but because making it himself was the honest gesture, and honesty was his best currency. When it was over and they stood facing each other with the valley all around them, Borgakh took his hands in both of hers and looked at him with those amber eyes that had, by now, been looking at him long enough that he had memorized every register and variation of what they said. She said, "I came back." He said, "I know, you always come back." And she pulled him into her arms with a care that was also strength, and held him the way she held everything she was serious about completely, and with full intention. And around them, the people who loved them made the sounds that people make when something real and good happens in their presence. The years that followed were full years, built of small dailiness and seasonal rhythm, and the particular deepening that happens between 2 people who have chosen each other not once, but continuously, with every morning and every difficulty and every evening on the south porch, watching the light go off the hills. Borgakh's healing practice grew steadily. By the 4th year she had established a permanent consultation space in the holding's 2nd room, with shelves of dried herbs and tinctures, and the careful written records she kept in a hand that had grown increasingly precise and professional. Settlers came from across the valley, and word of her competence traveled beyond it. She developed a specialty in bone setting and in the treatment of fever illness, 2 things that were in perennial demand in a frontier community, and she did the work with the same focused thoroughness she brought to everything. Her prices were fair and she took trade when coin was short, and over time her practice became one of the things the valley pointed to as a reason it was a good place to live. Amos's survey work became something more formalized when the territorial authority commissioned him to produce a comprehensive atlas of the Northern Territories, which took him 2 years and involved seasonal survey trips that he hated going on without her, and came home from with a speed that she said was flattering and he said was practical. The atlas was published, actually printed and bound, in the 7th year of their life together, and a copy of it went to the territorial capital, and a copy went on to their shelf, and a copy was sent to Corvin Tusk at the Greywood, who sent back a letter that said simply, "I knew it," which was the most he ever said about anything. In their 5th year, Borgakh became pregnant. She told Amos on a winter morning, very matter-of-factly, and he sat down rather suddenly on the nearest available surface, which was a wooden stool, and stayed there for a moment with an expression she described afterward as the specific face of a man who has received very good news faster than he was equipped for. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am extraordinarily all right," he said from the stool. "You look like you have been slightly hit," she observed. "That is accurate," he said. "Give me a moment." He stood up again within the moment and crossed to her and put his arms around her, carefully, which was his instinct with her now in a way that had nothing to do with any presumption of fragility. She was, as she had always been, considerably more physically robust than him, and they both knew it, and everything to do with the particular tenderness of a man who loves something very much and wants to protect it even when it doesn't need protecting. "We are going to have a child," he said into her hair, somewhat unnecessarily. "We are," she confirmed, with a warmth in her voice that she reserved for him and the goats. Their son was born in early autumn. He was a healthy, substantial baby with the green-tinted skin of his mother's heritage and his father's brown hair, and enormous amber eyes that looked at the world from the first with an expression of serious assessment. They named him Drewcat, after Borgakh's eldest brother, which was both a tribute and an act of deliberate connection to the clan she had been away from too long. Marga came for the birth, had arrived a week early in fact, with the certainty of a woman who has attended enough births to know that they operate on their own timeline and not the theoretical one. And she was there when young Drewcat entered the world and was the first of the grandparents to hold him, which she did with a gravity that slowly relaxed into something unconstrained and unguarded and entirely recognizable as love. She looked at Amos over the baby's head and said, "He has your jaw." "I hope that's not a disadvantage," Amos said. "It is a strong jaw," she said, which was as close to a compliment as she had ever offered him about himself directly, and he accepted it with appropriate gravity. Young Drewcat grew up in the valley with the goats and the herb garden and the maps and both worlds as his inheritance. He was, from early on, a physical child large for his age, inheriting his mother's build with a curiosity about how things worked that expressed itself in a series of increasingly ambitious small engineering projects, beginning with a modification to the goat fence when he was 4 and progressing through a small water wheel, a system of pulleys for lowering things from the cabin's loft, and a careful attempt to build a scale model of the valley's river system in a drainage ditch, which was less successful but highly educational. "He has your need to map things," Borgakh told Amos, watching the boy at work. "He has your need to understand how things function," Amos said. "We have made a very curious child. We have made a very excellent child," he said. Borgakh looked at him with that expression she had, the one that had taken him the longest to learn to read because it was the most interior, the most private, the one that meant she was feeling something so large she was not going to try to put it into words, but that she wanted him to know it was there. He knew. He always knew. In the 8th year of their life together, the holding expanded. They added a proper barn for the goats, whose number had grown from 4 to 11 through the natural enthusiasm of goats, and a second outbuilding that served as a dedicated space for Borgakh's healing practice and freed the second room of the cabin for other purposes. Amos built a proper study, which had been a theoretical project for years, with a long table for the maps and shelves for the record books and a south-facing window that let in light until nearly dark in summer. Borgakh helped him move books from their stacked positions against the cabin wall into the new shelves and said, standing back and looking at the full shelves, "Now it looks like you live here. As opposed to," he said, "as opposed to someone who borrowed the space," she said. "Before, with the books in piles, you always looked as though you might leave." She looked at the shelves for a moment. "Now you look settled." "I have been settled since the first winter in the Greywood," he said. "I know," she said, "but now the room knows it too." In their 9th year there was trouble, a serious kind, the type that does not resolve itself quickly. The territorial authority sent a new land steward to replace Davin Cole, who had retired to Veldrath with his wife, and the new steward was a man named Ulrich Voss Younger, from a town background, with views about frontier settlement that were less generous than Cole's had been. He began a review of all land grants in the valley, with the stated purpose of confirming their legal standing, which in practice meant examining grants that had been made to Orc settlers and mixed households, with considerably more scrutiny than those made to human-only ones. When his agent appeared at the holding with a bundle of papers and a professional manner that was not quite rude and not quite polite, Amos sat down at the map table with the man and went through every document with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. The original land grant, the registration records, the survey certification, the territorial charter clause that Davin Cole had cited years before, the tax records, which were immaculate because Amos had kept them that way. The community statements of record, 5 of them, from Valley residents, including one from the Hargrove family, which Amos had not solicited, and which had arrived with a handwritten note from old Marta Hargrove, saying that she was not much for politics, but that she knew good neighbors when she had them. The agent went away with his papers and came back 2 weeks later with a certification of full legal standing and no further action required. "You were very calm," Borgakh said that evening. "I was absolutely terrified the whole time," he said. She looked at him. "You did not show it." "I learned from you," he said. "Contain the fear, act with purpose." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for handling it the way you did." She paused. "You did not lose your temper, you did not make it worse." "Getting angry would have been satisfying and counterproductive," he said. "The documents were better." She reached across and took his hand. "Sometimes," she said, "I forget how much strength it takes to be the kind of person you are." He looked at her. "Borgakh," he said carefully, "you tore a cell door off a wall with your bare hands." "That kind of strength," she said, "I have in good supply. The kind you just used, the patient, precise, intelligent kind." She stopped, squeezed his hand. "I am proud of you," she said. "I want you to know that." He turned his hand so he was holding hers back properly and said, "And I of you, every day." The steward Ulrich Voss was replaced within a year. He was, it turned out, broadly unpopular across the valley for reasons that had nothing to do with Borgakh and Amos specifically, and the woman who replaced him, Terath Sund, made a point of visiting every established holding in the valley in her first month and introducing herself. When she came to their holding, she drank Borgakh's herbal tea and looked at Amos's new atlas and spent a long time reading the community statements of record that were still filed in the document box under the map table, and she left saying that the valley was in better shape than the territorial reports had suggested, and that the prior steward's review had been a waste of everyone's time. She was a practical woman, and they got along with her. Their daughter came in the 11th year, a second child, born easier than Drewcat, and arriving with an absolute certainty about her needs that expressed itself immediately and loudly. She had her father's brown hair and her mother's amber eyes, and a determination that, Marga said when she came for this birth as well, was entirely recognizable as Thunderroar. They named her Grath, for the elder who had paid Borgakh's fine a long time ago, who had told her that being right without power was dangerous, who had not lived to see Borgakh find her power and her place, but who was worth remembering. Young Drewcat, who was 6 by the time his sister arrived, and who had been tracking the whole process of her impending existence with an engineer's interest, accepted her arrival with a seriousness and a protectiveness that made Borgakh look at Amos over the baby's head with an expression that undid him entirely. "He is like you," she said. "He is like both of us," Amos said. "That's better." The holding in the Clearwater Valley became, over the years, a place that people knew. Not famous, that was not the word for it, known. The kind of known that means when someone in the valley is sick, they go to Borgakh, and when someone needs a route mapped or a property surveyed or a letter of official record drafted, they go to Amos. The kind of known where travelers stopping at Sable Ford ask where to find the healer and the mapmaker north of town and get straightforward directions because everyone knows. Young Drewcat, at 12, began accompanying his father on the shorter survey trips and was already better at certain kinds of terrain reading than many of the adult survey assistants Amos had employed over the years. Young Grath, at 6, had attached herself to her mother's healing practice with an intensity that Borgakh said she recognized, the same way she had felt at that age about her own mother's work, and was already grinding dried herbs with a competence and a commentary on the process that made the patients laugh. On an autumn evening in the 15th year of their life together, the 15th year counting from the summer they had walked to the Greywood, or the 14th counting from the winter in the camp, or depending on how you counted it, any number of years that were all in some sense the same year, the year they became something permanent. Amos and Borgakh sat on the south porch as they had sat 10,000 times before, with the valley going gold below them, and the last light on the far hills, and 2 cups of warm something between them, and the children's voices coming from inside where they were doing something loud and probably inadvisable with the goats. Borgakh said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "I think about the corridor," she said. "Cell block 7, the night I pushed the door, she looked at the hills. I have thought about it many times over the years, about what I was thinking and what I was feeling and what was going to happen next." She paused. "I thought I was leaving. I thought I was getting out and going north and figuring out what came after. I did not think there was a man at the end of the corridor with a book of maps. I was always there," he said, "just quietly." "You were always there quietly," she agreed. "And then you were very suddenly there loudly in the way of people who say the unexpected true thing." "I said you came back," he said. "It was not that loud." "It was loud enough," she said. "It was the first thing anyone had said to me in 11 days that was about me as a person rather than as an inconvenience or a problem." She looked at him. "You knew me. You remembered me. That was the loudest possible thing you could have said." He looked at her in the evening light that had, after all these years, settled into the permanent register of things he needed in order to know the world was ordered correctly. The strong lines of her face, the amber of her eyes, the way her hands rested on the porch arm with a stillness that he had come to understand as her version of peace. "I have thought about that night too," he said, "about sitting there with the maps and then hearing the door and looking up and seeing you standing in the gap." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know what I would have been without that. Some other version of myself in some other gray corridor, probably. The world would have fewer good maps," she said. "The world would have considerably less," he said, and looked at her in a way that left no ambiguity about what the word considerably was carrying. She reached across and took his hand in the simple, habitual, entirely comfortable way she had been doing for 15 years, and they sat in the fading light with the valley below and the children inside, and the goats making their evening sounds in the barn and the herb garden's autumn smell coming up from the terraced beds below the porch. And it was all the things it had always been, complicated and imperfect, and full of the particular texture of a life actually lived. And it was also, in every sense that mattered, everything. From inside came a crash and then young Drewcat's voice saying something careful and explanatory, and Grath's voice saying something much louder and considerably less explanatory, and Borgakh raised her eyes to the ceiling of the porch in the expression of a woman who has heard this kind of noise before and knows exactly what it means. "The goats," she said. "The goats," he confirmed. She stood in one fluid movement, still the most physically capable person in any room she entered, and went inside to investigate. He sat for a moment longer with the hills and the dusk and the sound of his family, his actual, real, improbable family, sorting out whatever goat-related disaster had befallen the kitchen, and he thought about an iron cell door on a stone corridor floor, and a woman standing in the gap with her hands dark with rust, and the completely true and precisely accurate thing he had said to her. "You came back." He had not known then what he was saying. He had thought he was saying something about memory, about recognition, about the particular clarity of his recall. And those things were true. But the larger truth, the one that he understood now in the way you only understand things after they have taken up permanent residence in your life, was that she had come back in every sense there was. Come back to him across the 11 days he had not known her. Come back to the way station in the rain. Come back to who she was when she stood in front of that door and decided to use her own strength. Come back and come back and come back. And he had been there. Quietly with his maps and his stool and his night watch, and then with everything else he had been there. He heard her laughter from inside the cabin, that low, genuine sound he had been collecting since the first winter in the Greywood, and Grath's higher voice joining it, and Druket's deeper already voice saying something that clearly had the cadence of, "I was only trying to," which was the start of almost every story he ever told about himself. Amos Ramsey stood up from the porch chair, stretched his back in the way of a man who had been doing outdoor work for 15 years and whose back had opinions about it, looked one more time at the valley going dark below, and went inside to his life. The holding stood for many decades after that. The maps that bore Amos Ramsey's name were still in use in the territory long after he had stopped walking the survey lines himself, and the copies of them in the territorial archive had a note on the cover page explaining that they had been updated and maintained first by the mapmaker's son, and eventually by his granddaughter, which told its own story about the kind of legacy that builds itself out of ordinary, consistent work. The healer's practice that Borgakh Thunderroar established in the Clearwater Valley was still called the Thunderroar practice long after she had passed the full weight of it to Grath, who had inherited both her mother's knowledge and her mother's hands-first certainty, and who practiced with a reputation for competence and directness that was entirely recognizable. The south porch of the holding remained standing, repaired and re-roofed twice in the decades after the original construction, because it faced the right direction, and the people who lived in the house valued the particular quality of light it caught in the evenings, and because some things that are made well and in the right spirit resist the ordinary erosion of time. And somewhere in the territorial archive, among the old custody records from Veldrath prison, there was a sheet that noted the escape of one prisoner from cell block 7 approximately 40 years prior, and the simultaneous dismissal of the night guard for negligence, and that no further action had been taken, and that the cell door had never been replaced. The warden of the time had noted in the margin, in handwriting that was clearly tired and slightly amused, that the door had been torn clean from its hinges from the inside, which he had personally inspected, and which he could only describe as remarkable, and which he was choosing not to pursue because the prisoner in question had been in on a charge he found unconvincing, and because the night guard had been, in the warden's private estimation, the best man he had employed in 20 years. And it seemed like a waste of everyone's time to make a larger affair of it. He had been right, in the specific practical way that practical men sometimes are. It had been, in the end, not an incident. It had been a beginning. And beginnings, when they are the right kind, do not need any more explanation than that.